Apparently, my last video wasn't loud enough for somebody. We'll try to do better in this one. I can hear myself fine. So, this is Russia TV interview with Scott Ritter.
We can cross live to Scott Ritter, who's a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer who also served.
Okay, so what's wrong with this picture here? I wonder how many of you have actually asked yourself this question. What's wrong with this here? So you have Russia TV, right? With two Americans and even former U.S. intelligence guy, right? Former. There's quite the story to that. Do you think they have Fox News in Russia? I mean, maybe, I don't know. They used to have CNN. So what are you looking at here, right? When we talk about Russian ideology, Russian secret services, Russian military intelligence, Russian whatever the fuck have you infiltrating the West, well, this is a perfect example of it, right? This is exactly what that is, right? Now, I know up until recently, CNN had a little Russian branch themselves, right? But they were basically banned, right? You heard a whole bunch about RT getting banned, right? Did you hear much about CNN getting banned in Russia and maybe other networks? Now, it wasn't formally banned, but they passed a law in Russia saying that anyone spreading fake news will be liable to go to jail, and then they passed a whole bunch of other laws of what you could or couldn't say, right? So they effectively they banned them from, saying whatever they want to say, right? And then Russia Today got the same kind of treatment in response. I mean, it doesn't matter like which came first, right? Well, how come we're only hearing about RT getting banned? Poor old RT, right? Funny. Anyway, yeah, this is a perfect example of, not to say that the West hasn't done the same thing, right? Yeah, they try to influence the hearts and minds of Russians too, right? Spread their ideology there. But this is a perfect example of what people are saying doesn't exist, right? Or it's just a conspiracy theory. It's right out in the open. The Russian government influencing the hearts and minds of Americans. This is just one example of it. Anyway, Ritter is a Russian asset, right? He's been on RT before. Here he is again. He's a Putin stooge, right? Anyone that knows anything about what goes on and is half intelligent should understand that. And this goes for the West too, right? That Russia TV will not have someone on there who could say things that don't go along with their agenda, right? So it doesn't matter how and if Ritter was convinced to say what he's about to say. They know ahead of time, more or less, what he's going to say. Shit, they might be even feeding him his lines. Some of them anyway, right? And if he's not a Russian asset, right, he's not going to be allowed to be on Russia TV, Russia Today, right? So anyone that's been on Russia Today, it's likely, well, I would say you'd have to assume that they're a Russian asset, right? How conscious they are of it, how they were convinced or coerced to do this, it's irrelevant, right? It's not that important. So Ritter, for those of you who don't know, was caught up in basically a sting operation where he did some, inappropriate things with someone whom he thought was 15 years old on the internet, right? That's what they told us, right? That's what we know. So, I'm not like trying to say that, not trying to use any ad hominem saying that, well, that means he can't be trusted, period. because he did some. Well, I guess there is no objective morality, so I can't. I guess I can't even moralize this, right? I'm being told I can't moralize anything anymore by people who moralize everything and never give any objective justification for why, right? Funny. Um, but I'm not trying to say that just because he did something wrong, right, with whom he thought was a teenage girl online, that he never speaks the truth, right? And I'm not trying to say that at all. What I am saying is that he's compromised, right? What else did he do that we don't know about, right? What other dirt do they have on him? Clearly, he got caught up in the sting operation, right? Someone didn't like him. Maybe they had reason to believe he was committing treason but couldn't quite prove it, or he was just not saying the right things, right? Like the West wants you to say certain things too, so they compromised him, right? And so you can't trust a compromised asset, right? The guy is, if he's compromised, it's likely that he's just controlled, that he just says things that, maybe he says things to get back at somebody, or he's peed off about something, so and he's gonna make shit up, or maybe somebody somewhere out there has more dirt on him, and he can no longer say what he wants. Who cares, right? It doesn't matter. He's compromised. Period. But let's see what he has to say anyway.
With the United Nations. Scott, lots to unravel here. It's early stages, of course, but Russia has called for a UN Security Council meeting today in light of the shocking images coming out of Bucha. What can we expect from this meeting, given that the French president, for one, has already blamed Russia for what's happened in Bucha and killing all of these killings on the Russian forces, actually?
Well, unfortunately, the Security Council of the United Nations has become part of the overall propaganda battlefield. And I don't think Russia can expect anything other than the opportunity to voice, its concern over what it is saying is a falsified story, unverified allegations. So, Russia's taking advantage of, whatever forum it has to get its version of events out, but I don't think I think the French, the British, the Americans, and maybe some others will do their best to muddy the waters.
And to be clear,
how does he know this, right? Clearly, the guy is a Putin stooge, right? He's a Russia stooge. Clearly anti-West, right? So this is a guy that worked in U.S. intelligence that's anti-U.S., right? Is that another example of Russian, Soviet, Marxist thought permeating the American power structure, right? Is that why they try to get rid of him? Did get rid of him, right? Got him caught up in some BS? Is it? Anyway, I know it says he's in New York State, but I mean, looking at that Eastern European looking curtain and that bookshelf there, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he was actually hiding out in Russia.
in the midst of all of the he said, she said, the images and the situation on the ground there is absolutely horrific. But that said, Moscow...
I thought pink ties were considered inappropriate by the conservatives in America, right? I guess it's all good in traditionalist Russia. I'm kind of fucking around, but I mean, it is what it is.
Has described the events as a blatant provocation by Kiev to disrupt peace talks. Is there any evidence to back up this allegation?
Well, there is plenty of evidence. It just hasn't been collected, or if it has been collected, it hasn't been processed and presented.
There's plenty of evidence, it just hasn't been collected. Whatever, this guy's not making any sense. So, this whole thing is going to go on and on and on and on and on. And, it's just going to drag out forever. And, what this reminds me of is the whole hullabaloo with mask good, mask bad, right? mask on, mask off. What this is, in my opinion, is, and both the East and the West are working together, obviously, as if it wasn't obvious, by exactly that which is right here before you, right? Two Americans on Russia TV or Russia Today. Clown world, right? Like, people don't even question these things. It's just like, it's weird, isn't it? Anyway, this is just meant to create confusion, arguing. This is classic divide and conquer, right? Distraction, get you to engage in the nonsense instead of, actually doing something that matters. This is just supposed to burn up your time and energy, right? These are energy vampires, inertia generators. That's what this is. That's what this is designed to do. And fuck it. Let's listen to a little bit more.
This is simple medical forensics. When you have a dead body, you subject that body to a forensic investigation, inclusive of an autopsy, that should be able to show the time of death, the mechanism of death, and if the body had been moved to that location, or if that's the place where they died. If the Ukrainians are making these allegations, one would hope that they would carry out these kinds of investigations, these forensic investigations, and provide that data to.
Really, an autopsy and all this forensic stuff he's talking about is going to tell you, like, whether it was a Ukrainian or a Russian that killed these people? Are there no Ukrainians fighting in the Russian army? Are there no Russians fighting on the Ukrainian side? Right? Like, this is a whole bunch of nonsense. It's just supposed to burn up your time. Right? If we all stuck to our guns and had principles, right? This would be real easy to solve, right? The question here is easy. Putin invaded a sovereign country, an independent, whatever the fuck that means, right? Country. And I thought we weren't cool with that, right? So everything that precipitated from Russia invading Ukraine is basically Russia's fault. None of it would have happened had Russia not gone in there, right? That doesn't mean that Russians killed these people, right? But, I mean, what the fuck, right? This is a quagmire, just like Serbia was a fucking quagmire, right? Just this constant bickering, constant disinformation on both sides, constant confusion, constant chaos, right? Just to demoralize you, so that you never know what's right or what's wrong, what's up or what's down, and you just keep bickering amongst yourselves instead of uniting and fighting these bastards.
To corroborate these allegations they made, the fact that Ukraine hasn't presented this data and instead went forward with a narrative based solely upon video evidence of unproven provenance, to me is a clear indication that what we're seeing may not be reflective of the actual truth on the ground.
Speaking of that and the timing,
just a whole bunch of bullshit, right? Clear evidence that what we're seeing may not be what they're saying. Something like that, right? Clear evidence of something that may or may not have happened. Like, that makes any sense.
also, Russia says that there was shelling of Bucha by the Ukrainian military right after the withdrawal of Russian troops. If this is true, why do you think that fact has been
Is he going to ask for forensic evidence, right, of this claim?
ignored by Western leaders?
Well, again, because we come down to the fact that almost Russia has been very assiduous in its use of force during its military operations in Ukraine.
right? This guy's a Putin stooge because he says so, right? Because he says so.
Ukraine, and I think it's clear that the Russian army has been under orders to minimize the potential harm that.
I think it's clear. Listen to what he's saying, right? That Russian soldiers have been under orders to this, and that. Did you investigate any of this? Like, this isn't even investigative journalism. This is just like, I say whatever I feel like saying, right? And what I feel like saying, for whatever reason, right, is that Russia good, West bad. That's all that this guy is saying. He's not really saying anything worthwhile. Nothing worth your while. So why are we listening to him? Well, I mean, stick around.
Could befall Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, and whatever harm is befalling them at the hands of Russia is because the Ukrainian government has turned residential areas into battlefields, etc.
Right. So if Russians happen to kill Ukrainians, it's the Ukrainian government's fault, right? Not the fault of the country. Like, this is such nonsense. It's not the fault of the country that invaded Ukraine. It's the fault of the government and the Ukrainians defending themselves. It's their fault that they're dying. Well, clearly Ukraine has mobilized pretty big, from what I understand, civilian force that are defending their country, their homes. Right? They live in these cities that they are defending. Right?
So, Russia.
So it's clear. Clearly, this is just Russian propaganda, right? Just a whole bunch of bullshit. Not to say that what you see, and I've made fun of CNN, right? But this is the thing, right? CNN, for example, is just so blatantly fake and bad in so much of their reporting, right? Not everything, but that you get Russia Today, which is, not as bad, and all of a sudden that gives it credibility in a lot of simpletons' eyes, right? Because Russia Today was banned, right, in the West. Well, that gives it credibility. Like, Alex Jones was banned, right, off YouTube, and that gave him credibility in a lot of people's eyes. He was somehow banned, and he's done nothing but grow his empire after he got banned off YouTube, right? You got, like, heads of state mentioning his name and shit, giving him free publicity and promotion. I mean, the guy has done nothing but gotten richer since he was banned off YouTube. Is that why they're banning some of these guys? Because they know that's going to give them credibility? Like Joe Rogan, right? Going over to Spotify. A lot of people seem to think that Joe Rogan is somehow credible when he's just a big pharma shill and so much more shill, right? So, like, what is this guy? This is just such nonsense.
I believe clearly has demonstrated its intent to abide by the law of war. The Ukrainian government, on the other.
Oops, I guess they didn't coach him all that well, right? To abide by the law of war. This isn't war, buddy. This is a special military operation. You just earned yourself 10 years in a Russian gulag, buddy, for saying that on Russia Today.
And has not, and they have opted to make residential areas battlefields and therefore use their own civilians as human shields. And this isn't me making this up. This is the Washington Post, which is notoriously pro-Ukrainian.
So the Ukrainians are just supposed to go, right? The Ukrainian army, which is not as strong as the Russians, not as well equipped. Well, by now it probably is. But they're just supposed to go out and meet the Russians in an open field, right? But, all you Putin stooges, you eat that shit up, right? Oh, they're using civilians as human shields. No, they mobilize their civilians to fight the Russians. What do you mean they're using them as human shields? They force them to stay in those tenements where where Ukraine was, fortifying their or setting up their fortifications. They forced them to stay there. They told them they couldn't. What the fuck are you talking about? Like, just this is such nonsense, right?
Having to admit what the facts on the ground are. So I think one of the reasons why the West is downplaying, the fact that it was the Ukrainian government shelling Bucha, and that, there's a possibility.
So both Zelensky and Putin are Klaus Schwab minions, right? They're both members of the World Economic Forum. So, yeah, I could see why Ukrainians are shelling their own cities, right? Some people in the Ukrainian army have been given orders to destroy their cities, right? Just as Russians are. Because, in my opinion, again, they're working together to destroy these cities so they could build back better, right? When America does it, evil. When Russia and Ukraine, or when Russia is doing it, I mean, who knows who's going to get the contracts to come in and rebuild Ukraine, right? Probably Russia, China, Israel, right? I mean, the goal is to get U.S. the fuck out of Eurasia, right? Kazakhstan. So, I doubt it's going to be U.S. I mean, maybe some American firms too will get some contracts, but it's going to be primarily, those people, the Eurasians, rebuilding Ukraine, right? But first you got to raise it to the ground before you could build back better. Shit, something else I wanted to say. So, whatever.
Probability that these dead civilians were killed by Ukrainian, having to admit what the facts on the ground are. So I think one of the reasons why the West is downplaying, the fact that
So this whole idea that like Russians invaded Ukraine and they had no intention of attacking cities, but Russians started bombing infrastructure in and around Ukrainian cities, right? So shouldn't the Ukrainian military position themselves in the cities to defend against that? But as soon as they do that, this stooge comes on and says Ukrainians are using their people as human shields. Wait, Russia attacked the cities, Ukrainians are defending the cities. Like, these are the facts on the ground. Like, oh man, people are so gullible.
Was the Ukrainian government shelling Bucha, and that, there's a probability that these dead civilians were killed by Ukrainians. They don't want that to come out. That's inconvenient to the narrative that they're trying to pursue.
Right, so both of them are spinning the same narrative without any evidence. He doesn't have any proof, right? He was asking for all this forensic proof and evidence, right? That Russians killed Ukrainians after attacking Ukraine in Ukraine. How dare you say that, right? I mean, that makes the most sense. But now he's saying that it was you, and he could be right, right? But I mean, what does the hypocrisy? Come on.
Of a nefarious Russia.
Now, Scott, the idea of justice is basically, well, when it comes to war, I don't know if we can even use that word, but what needs to happen for those responses?
When it comes to war, I don't know if we could even use that word. Which word? Justice? Or war? We can't even use... I mean, how is it that people on Russian TV, right, are using the word war when they're not supposed... I don't know. It is what it is. There was a little bit more. So here you have Gerald Celente talking to Scott Ritter again. Both of these guys are Russia Today stooges, right? Assets. Both of them are Russian assets. Russia Today may have been taken off YouTube, but Gerald hasn't, and they're going to push the propaganda, the RT propaganda, as much as they can, right?
and your knowledge of the system?
The system. Well, I guess I was born into the system. My father was a career Air Force officer, and I was raised around the world as an Air Force brat. I went to high school in Hawaii, Turkey, and Germany. The importance of the last two is the reason why we were in Turkey and Germany was because of the Cold War. And both Turkey and Germany were outposts of the United States in the front lines against the Soviet Union.
So when he was in Germany, maybe he got turned out, right? Or he got turned. He got turned red, whatever the hell, right? Maybe, which is why he was, gotten rid of and compromised.
In the Cold War. So I was very much a child of the Cold War. Growing up an Air Force brat with the Soviet threat being, broadcast every day, I decided to follow my father's footsteps. I went to college, got a degree in Russian history, following under the precepts of Sun Tzu, the art of war, know your enemy as yourself. So I would study the Russians, their culture, their literature, their history, their language, in preparation to go off to war and kill them. I joined the Marine Corps for the sole purpose of closing with and destroying the Soviet enemy through firepower maneuver. And for 2.5 years, I worked in the deserts of 29 Palms, California, learning the trade of war, learning how to.
And obviously that's, morally permissible and totally cool and fine because, well, I mean, what's your objective justification for why him wanting to kill Ruskies is wrong, right? I got Christians, right? Christians who moral fag about everything. Everything, right? Always moral fagging about Pornhub, abortion, degeneracy, right? Killing innocent human beings, murder, wrong, right? But then Russia does it, and the first thing out of their mouth, a lot of them anyway, is, what's your objective moral justification for why that's wrong, right? Fucking hell.
Fight the Soviets. And as soon as I mastered my art, then Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan go and sign the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in December of 1987, which basically eliminated entire categories of nuclear weapons. And the Soviet Union went from being the enemy to being somebody that I would have to learn to cooperate with for disarmament. I was picked to be one of the first inspectors to go into the Soviet Union and implement the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And I spent 2 years working outside of a Soviet missile factory in Votkinsk.
Wow.
And it was an eye-opening experience. So one of the other things that happened is the INF Treaty, for the first time, incorporated on-site inspection as a verification means of determining whether or not somebody is in compliance with the treaty. It had never been done before, so I was among the inspectors that literally wrote the book on on-site inspection. And when my time with the on-site inspection agency ended in July of 1990, I went back to the Marine Corps right in time for Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait. And I became caught up in the war, as did many, and ended up being assigned to General Norman Schwarzkopf's staff as an intelligence officer in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And because of my experience in the Soviet Union with missiles, I was given the Scud portfolio. So one of my jobs was to work with the U.S. Air Force and coalition special forces to hunt down and interdict Iraqi Scud missiles before they could be launched against either Israel or the Gulf Arab states. I finished with what they call a good war, and what that means is I lived, and I came out with a good reputation of a man who could do his job. But when I left, when the war ended, I went back to the Marine Corps, and I was struggling with what my purpose as a Marine was anymore. Because I wasn't joking when I talked about being a child of the Cold War, and joining the Marine Corps to kill Russians. Literally, that's what the Cold War was about, being prepared to stand up to the Soviet threat. And yet now I just spent the last 2 years being friends with the Russians, and the Cold War was over.
So he experienced what in psychology they call transference, I believe, right? He got, he caught fifis, he caught feels for the people he was supposed to be just working with, right? He was supposed to be professional.
There was no need for me to continue down this path. There was really, in the intelligence business, in the Cold War, the ultimate jobs were either with what was called the military liaison mission, operating out of Potsdam, East Germany, outside of Berlin, to spy on the Soviet group of forces in Germany. It was a very elite job, and that's what I wanted to do. I also wanted to be a defense attaché in Moscow, who would travel around Russia, sneaking away from the KGB to get close to targets of intelligence value so I could take photographs and stuff like that.
Wow.
We weren't doing that anymore. So I was left saying, well, what is the purpose? I just fought my war. I served my country. Maybe it's time for me to get out of the Marine Corps and pursue a different life. So I actually left the Marine Corps with an eye on working in the former Soviet Union as the country manager for H.J. Heinz, food processing company. You might know them as the tomato people. And I was going to help install and manage food processing plants in southern Russia. I thought it was going to be a fascinating job. But in August of 1991, there was a coup that overthrew Gorbachev, and Boris Yeltsin became famous for jumping on a tank. The coup was overthrown. But because of the unrest and the turmoil and the uncertainty, H.J. Heinz withdrew from the Soviet project, and I was unemployed. And at the moment of my greatest concern about being unemployed, I got a phone call from a colonel I used to work for in Russia. He was now the chief of staff for the United Nations Special Commission in Iraq, which was tasked with performing on-site inspections in Iraq to oversee the disarmament of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Originally, they built the inspection process along the lines of the INF Treaty, on the notion that the Iraqis would provide a declaration, elicit the totality of their WMD, and then the inspectors would go in a very gentlemanly fashion to confirm the declaration was complete, and then to oversee the...
Yeah, so you basically switch sides, right? Which is probably why they got rid of him, or why they, conducted that sting operation and got a bunch of dirt on him, right? Or, I mean, I don't know what the chronology here is. Maybe they forced him to go. I don't know. But this could go a lot of different ways. I guess it's not all that important.
The account here, the dismemberment, the disarming, dismantlement of these weapons of mass...
The point is, the guy is just compromised and confused.
Destruction. That's how the INF Treaty worked, with the United States and the Soviets providing declarations, etc. Well, the Iraqis lied. They failed to declare entire programs. They failed. These inspectors had to... 14 of them as a chief. Iraq sanctions would be lifted when it comes to U.S. policy in the Middle East, and U.S. to account if they're deviating from the norms and values that we claim to embrace as a people. So I'm pretty proud of the fact that I've been speaking out. Now, on the issue of Ukraine, as I mentioned, I used to train to fight the Soviets. And Soviet doctrine is similar to Russian doctrine today. I'm a student of Russian military history. I've worked in the Soviet Union, and I have contacts in the past. And
people want to pretend like the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation are like two different things, right? Sure.
Continued contacts with the Soviet military, etc. So I'm very familiar with Russian doctrine, the Russian military, and things of that nature. So when this conflict started, I felt that I was in a position to accurately assess what was actually going on in the ground in the face of what was an overwhelming amount of politicized information coming from the mainstream media that seeks to tell the narrative from a Ukrainian perspective in a manner that doesn't necessarily reflect the actuality of what's taking place. So I've been speaking out lately about what I believe could be happening on the ground. I need to make it clear that while a lot of people talk about the Russian playbook, I don't have it.
So he's basically doing the same thing the Western media is doing while pretending to somehow be different. The only difference is that he's pro-Russia, right? He's essentially saying they're bullshitting, right? Imagining, inventing stuff, right? While at the same time saying that that's exactly what he's doing. He doesn't know what's going on. It's just what he believes to be going on, right?
So I can't tell you what's in the Russian playbook. I don't think anybody has it. They haven't published a playbook. And when people talk about the intent of Vladimir Putin, I don't have a phone that I can pick up and call Vladimir Putin and ask him what his intent is. And I don't think any of the people who speak of Putin have that either. So there's a lot of people out there proclaiming that they have special insight into the thinking of the Russian leader and into the plans of the Russian military leadership. They don't. I don't either. What I do have is a history of experience about the Russian military that allows me to look at a map to assess information and determine whether or not that is consistent with what I understand the facts to be, or if it deviates to such an extent that...
So he's going to look at a map and basically just give you pure conjecture and the shit he believes, right? And that's somehow going to counter the fake news coming out of the West.
Maybe we have to question whether or not this information is accurate.
So what do you see going on?
Well, what I see going on right now is a Russian response that is decades in the making. There's a lot of people that say that what Putin has done in Ukraine is a very impetuous, rash act.
So in his opinion, Putin has been planning to invade Ukraine for decades. Oops. So what did he just admit to? He believes that the whole Donbass thing is just bullshit, right? It's just a bullshit excuse.
That it's a gamble. That Putin is gambled. And this creates the notion of a leader who is a risk taker, who's not certain.
And that's been the contradiction of just Putin stooges out in the West, right? Saying that NATO has agitated him for a while, which is why he's invaded. I guess that's not a contradiction, but kind of a conflicting narrative, two different narratives, right? He invaded because of NATO expansion, while at the same time saying that he's denazifying Ukraine by using, Russian Nazis. I mean, which one do you think makes more sense? Could both of them be true? I mean, yeah, I suppose so. But I mean, if this was decades in the making, then, as we know, right, he had his hand in the making of Donbass, right? Because that's just another excuse for him to do something he's been wanting to do for decades, right? So, Alexander Dugin had this, when he was interviewed by a Polish journalist years ago, he basically said that the Baltic states, Ukraine and Poland, are in the way of Russia and Germany uniting together, right? These, and this is something that none of these political analysts, right? He studied Russian history, but none of these stooges talk about this stuff, whether they're in the West or, they're pro-West or pro-Russia. None of them talk about the fact that Russia and Germany have been working together for a very, very long time. None of them talk about the fact that German royalty has controlled Russia for 1,000 years now, right? None of them talk about any of this because that would point you to a link between the evil West and the virtuous Russia, right? That's not a very convenient narrative, is it? To this bullshit that you guys like to put out there. So, as Dugin stated, all these states are in the way, and we need to get rid of them so that Russia and Germany can be together again, right? Like they tried in World War II. But I guess we'll get to that in just a second.
Where he stands, who is confronted with the problem and is seeking to take a shortcut to a solution. No, this is a problem that has been in the making since 1997, when NATO began its process of expanding.
It's a problem that's been in the making since 1,000 years ago. But the problem, right? The people that are in the way of these Germanic people, the Semites, right? Taking control of Europe and Eurasia apparently now. Not to say that they haven't let in some of the native people, right? But the people that have been in the way, right, are the Slavic people. That's why you always see in all these world wars, right? You see those people being exterminated. Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, people, the Baltic people, right? Balto-Slavs. I don't know if that's an archaic term or not anymore. But the, people in Estonia, Lithuania, so on and so forth, right? Yeah, they stand in the way, these Japhetites stay in the way of the Semite having complete control of Europe.
Allowing former Warsaw Pact nations into the NATO alliance and gradually moving towards the border with Russia. This is a problem that has been ongoing since 1999, when Boris Yeltsin stepped aside and brought in Vladimir Putin as the president of Russia. Boris Yeltsin, of course, ran Russia during the decades of the 90s in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, who allowed the United States and other countries to run roughshod over Russian sovereignty, to view Russia as an economic opportunity for carpetbaggers to come in and rob Russia blind, who empowered a class of oligarchs who stole Russia's wealth and made it their own. And the United States was all too happy with Yeltsin. And when Yeltsin stepped aside and brought in Vladimir Putin said, we're no longer playing that game. Russia's a sovereign state. We're going to assert our sovereign control over our own economy, etc. People in the West started viewing him as a threat to the Western-based hegemony that had been established over Russia. So, this is a problem that when you combine NATO expansion with a leader that's...
So he basically, and he's not the only one probably, not the first in line, but he wanted in on the scheme, right? He wants in on it. And he's gotten more than in on it, right? He isn't, but they say he is, the richest man on the planet, some people say. So he's gotten in on the fucking scheme, right? But we're gonna talk about oligarchs, how they're the problem, right? And he just wanted in on the fucking grift. And he got in. He's been bought in, right? That's why he's Klaus Schwab's stooge.
Now viewed as a threat. NATO expansion is no longer simply about bringing a security framework over Eastern Europe to prevent Eastern Europe from becoming like Yugoslavia. That was the original thinking behind the expansion of NATO. We must secure Eastern Europe to prevent Europe from confronting a series of Yugoslavia-type breakups and conflicts. But then as the expansion went over, you have Putin being perceived as a threat, so now Russia is a threat, And that threat is magnified in the eyes of the former Soviet satellite states like Poland and the Baltics, who have no love lost for Russia, so they magnify the notion of a Russian threat. And from a Russian perspective, they're now looking at an expanding NATO coming up to their borders that represents a direct threat to Russia. And Russia had been speaking out about this. In 2007, Vladimir Putin gave what I consider to be one of the greatest political speeches in modern history. And that is addressed before the Munich Security Council.
Right, he's a Putin stooge, basically. He's in love. He's smitten.
Where he was supposed to be brought in as an act of surrender. The West expected him to bow down before his Western masters, to kiss the ring of his overlords, to start playing the game of becoming assimilated into the West. Instead, Putin stood there in front of an audience of Western power brokers, and he chastised them. He chastised them about being acolytes of the United States. He chastised the United States about seeking to impose a singularity on the world. He chastised Europe and the United States about what had been done in Iraq after the 2003 invasion and occupation. Do you not know what you have done?
Singularity, right? He wanted in on the fucking grift, and he got in. Which is why Russia is building smart cities now, and they're part of the NWO, obviously.
He told them about Iraq. You've destroyed a nation. You have lied. You've destroyed the international legal framework.
Right? He criticized them for doing that, and now he's doing the same thing in Ukraine. So he's on the team, obviously.
And then he said, the day of the unilateral polarity is over. The world will now move to a multipolar situation that Russia will be one of equals. The world will include.
That's exactly what it is, right? He just wanted in on the fucking grift. And he got in. That's literally what he's telling you.
Many different powers, including Russia and the United States, but others as well. His speech was not well received. And instead of listening to him, the United States and NATO doubled down in 2008. The Bucharest Security Summit for NATO formally invited Ukraine and Georgia to be members of NATO. How did Russia view this? We know, because not only do we have the statements of Putin and others, William Burns, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, wrote a memorandum that was sent out in February of 2009, the title of which is "Niet means niet," no means no. And what he was saying is that when the Russians say that the expansion of NATO into Ukraine is a red line, they mean it's a red line. They're not joking. They're not bluffing. And then he set out two things. He said, one, the Russian concerns are real, are genuine, meaning that the West should not just dismiss these concerns as, Russian, pouting. No, this is a real concern. The consequences, and this is a very important part of his memorandum, the consequences of ignoring Russia will mean that in the future, Russia will have no choice but to militarily intervene, which will result in the destruction of Ukraine, the loss of Crimea, and the loss of Donbass. This was written in 2009, pre-2014. And already, the U.S. Ambassador William Burns knows.
Yeah, so the East and the West decided to destroy Ukraine a long, long time ago. Just like Hitler and Stalin signed a pact, and decided to destroy everything that stood between Moscow and Berlin. And that's exactly what they did.
And if NATO keeps expanding, the outcome will be a Ukraine that is destroyed and which no longer includes Crimea and the Donbass. So the West can't claim, as Michael McFaul, who was later the U.S. ambassador under Barack Obama.
And this whole idea that Putin had no choice. Come on, this is nonsense, right? The day before he invaded Ukraine, he had a choice he chose not to invade. And then he chose to invade. What do you mean he had no choice? He could have not invaded. What do you mean he had no choice? Or what? This is such nonsense. He had no choice, right? Someone held a gun to his head and said you have to invade Ukraine? Really? Even though he planned this, like this guy just told you, he planned it with the West a long time ago. This has been decades in the making. But he had no choice. He planned this for decades, but he had no choice.
Repeatedly said that when he was with the National Security Council and when he was ambassador, he never heard about Russia's concerns about NATO, implying that Russia's just making this up. Well, he was in the National Security Council in February of 2009 when Burns' memorandum was written. So McFaul is either the worst informed national security expert on Russia, or he's a liar. Because Burns' memorandum was there, everybody was talking about it, everybody knew that this was a concern for NATO, but the West ignored it and continued to pursue. Then after 2014, when the United States worked to
So if my neighbor, right, is walking on the road adjacent to my property 3 times a day and I have concerns about that, because I have concerns, right? Stuff goes missing, or my dogs bark and it's loud, right? He's stomping out the grass that's growing out there, and I believe it's pretty, right? If I have concerns about my neighbor playing loud music next door and he doesn't listen to my concerns and adjust it, he doesn't allow me to control his behavior, then I guess I get to murder him, right? I mean, wow. Concerns, though.
throw the pro-Western president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, through the Maidan Revolution, Russia became doubly.
Okay, let's make it a little more analogous. And my neighbor bought a gun. I know he owns a gun, and he sometimes shoots targets in his backyard, and it's loud, and he has a gun, and I don't like it. I guess I get to murder him now. Yay, because, you know. Do you have any objective justification for why I can't do that?
Because now, overnight, Ukraine went from being a problematic but friendly border country to a hyper-nationalistic. And when I say nationalistic, I mean the nationalism of Stepan Bandera, a former Nazi supporter whose forces not only slaughtered Jews during World War II, but also slaughtered Poles and Russians in the decade after the Second World War during a 10-year-long insurgency. It cost over 300,000 civilian lives, around 36,000 Russian security lives. This force had been under the ground, but now through the Maidan Revolution, we had brought them into the mainstream. We had weaponized them, weaponized Nazi ideologies.
Right, he's telling you literally what happened. We weaponized them, right? We did this so that we could have an excuse to go in there. But what he won't tell you is that the Russian Tsars, by the genocides of the Cossacks, right? The Soviets, the Bolsheviks, right? By genociding Ukrainians in the Holodomor. Poland played their part in antagonizing Ukrainians with some of the political moves that they made, right? Like, people in the region have fomented this sort of ultra-nationalistic Cossack nation, right? But this is why these ultra-nationalistic Nazi, right? That's what that means. Forces are being fomented so that you can have an excuse to go in there. I'm not saying that that's been going on for 1,000 years now or something like that, but yeah, like, to completely take out of the context the fact that the Ukrainian people have been fucked over, right? Which pushed them to the brink of Nazism, right? Like, didn't this guy study Russian history? To completely ignore that and just say, like, oh, the Ukrainians are just evil, right? Period. There's no reason why. It's not because they were systematically genocided by Tsarist Russia, right? No, that has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with the Soviet Union genociding them, right? There's nothing to do. Tsarist Russia, Soviet. What's the difference? What's the fucking difference? Different figurehead, same monster, right? We're just gonna completely. I'm not saying that the reaction is just, but you could understand where it came from, right? We're just gonna take it all out of the context and act like Ukrainians they're just born evil. That's it. They're just born evil.
Is what we're talking about here. And Russia said this is a threat. That began the threat to Russia because they were basically seeking to purge Russian culture, Russian language from Ukraine, which they wanted to be a pure.
And the Soviet Union did the exact same thing. To try to purge them and destroy them. Right? But this Putin stooge won't tell you that.
Ukrainian state. So Russia took the Crimea to protect the Russian majority population there, and Russia supported Russian separatists in the Donbass to protect them from the Ukrainians. This began an 8-year war, and there was an international agreement done through what's called the Normandy format. That is Germany, France, with Russia.
So Russia's been waging war on Ukrainian territory for 8 years now, right? But it's all Ukraine's fault. Russia, Soviet Union, right? Same shit. Has been genociding Ukrainians for shit, probably 1,000 years now, or as soon as that national identity emerged, right? Whenever that was. But it's it's not Russia's fault.
Observation and Ukraine negotiated a settlement which would have brought an end to the conflict in the Donbass, recognized the Donbass to be part of Ukraine, but that the Russians would be subjected to a special autonomous status that was separate from the constitutional language that made Ukraine first language, et cetera, Ukrainian. The Russian presidents, Poroshenko and then Zelensky, refused to sign it, not because it was a bad deal, but because if they signed it, the neo-Nazis that were now empowered have said they would kill them. So we have a situation where the Russian government, the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian policy is being dictated by neo-Nazi ideology. And if you know anything about the former Soviet Union, about Russia, you know that they don't take the issue.
They exterminated and genocided Ukrainians for hundreds of years now.
Of Nazi ideology lightly. 23 million to 32 million.
So Alexander Dugin, right, is a Nazi, basically. Well, he's a Nazi / Bolshevik, right? He wants to combine both of those beautiful ideologies together, right? But if you know anything about Russians, right? So the ideology of Russia was based on, inspired by Karl Marx, very much like Nazi ideology, right? They come from the same place. Where's that? Germany. And I'm not talking, when I've made this clear in other videos, I'm not talking about the rank and file Germans, right? Which are Germanized Slavs for the most part. Many of them anyway. I'm talking about the elites, right? The Semitic German elites.
Soviet citizens lost their lives in a conflict with Nazi Germany.
Yep.
And in every town, every village.
So, he talks about Russians, right? The Slavs that lost their lives. Fighting, the Germanized Slavs, basically, while the elites, apparently Hitler ran off to his Shangri-La somewhere in Antarctica, if you are to believe that theory, and who knows what happened to these other guys that were in charge of Russia, right? But this idea that while it's true that eventually Russia and Germany fought on the battlefield, right? Well, this guy completely ignores the fact that they signed an agreement to divvy up, which is what's been happening throughout history in that region of the world, right? Like, they've been divvying up, looking to control and divide, whether it was the Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Germanic Empire, right, in the First World War, or Kaiser Wilhelm's Prussian Empire, right, Germanic, after they took over the Balto Slavs, because the original Russians, right, weren't Germanic people, okay? The shape-shifting Semitic Germans took on their identity the same way they took on the identity of the original what the Rome called Germanic people, which were Slavs, right? They took that identity, then they took the Prussian identity, and they kept moving in that direction. And it wasn't up until like 130ish or so years ago that Germany actually appeared as what we know it today, right? Because prior to that, it was the Holy Roman Empire. Germany is a very, very, very young country. Germania was primarily populated by Slavs at the time that Julius Caesar, I think it was Caesar, called it that, right? Or his historians. So, this guy won't tell you that Hitler and Stalin signed a pact, right? To divvy up Central and, everything that was between Berlin and Moscow, to divvy it up amongst themselves. I don't know what happened there exactly, but if there ever was, I'm just speculating now, if there ever was what you would consider a good implication of divide and conquer, right? With, I don't know, maybe the Brits, maybe the Americans playing their card. I don't know what happened there, right? But at some point, maybe it was just, Cain and Abel. But at some point, Russia and Germany went back on their promise and the contract they signed together, and they started fighting one another. But maybe that just had to do with depopulating. I don't know. That region of the world. I don't know, but because you look at Stalin's policies and you look at Hitler's policies. I mean, those fuckers were genocidal maniacs, right? And that's just what they did. But maybe they, maybe that's what happens. Maybe it was one of those boss battles and somebody had to go. I don't know. Maybe they got divided and conquered. Who the fuck knows? I wish we could know the truth one day. But the point still stands, right? They signed a pact and they were working together up until a certain point. And maybe even to the very end, right? Whatever the goals were presented to us as whatever they were presented, that could have just been bullshit, right? And behind the scenes, they had another different agreement and carried it out to a T, right? We got the EU and we got the Russian USSR, right? We got two, these supranational bodies that have trampled over, various people's nationalities and sovereignty, right? Centralized government, right? Global communism, or one step closer to global communism, right? The EU and USSR. Two sides of the same coin, really, right? So, I don't know, but this guy completely glosses over the fact that the fucking Soviets were no better than the Nazis, and they had their own concentration camps too, right? No one talks about that. I mean, they shot plenty of people in the back of the head and buried them underground, right? But no, I don't have any objective justification for why that was wrong. Just like you don't have any objective justification for why it was wrong for Jeffrey Dahmer to eat people, right? Because objective morality doesn't exist. Because what? Fuck out of here, man. I know this is the longest video, but like, not sure what the point of it is exactly. Just talking about fucking propaganda, nonsense, and these Russian assets everywhere, man. And it's just as bad as the West. It's just as bad. And the West isn't. Both of these guys are supposed to be Americans, right? Why are they working for Russia? Explain that to me, right? It's because the West has been infiltrated by commies, Marxists. just, it is what it is. Anyway, and what it is just a bunch of nonsense. Just a bunch of lies, misrepresentation, like lying by omission mostly. And this is what, because this is RT, okay? If you know anything about these two stooges, like they are, they're RT assets. But this is basically RT operating kind of covertly, right? After they were taken off YouTube. And they'll go on to, Gerald will go on to talk about how he used to be on CNN all the time, and then they didn't like what he had to say, and then he switched sides and went over to RT, right? So these guys are just opportunists. They'll go where the dollar is. They'll go where they get to. They're allowed to say what they're allowed to say, right? It's just, for him to discredit the CNN, and he's correct in doing so, right? Because they're saying that they kicked him out because he wasn't towing that party line, right? What he's admitting is that, well, the reason why RT had him on is because he was towing that party line, right? It's two sides of the same coin. It's this constant game of political football they keep playing with us. And a whole bunch of clowns keep falling for this nonsense. They accept these highly edited versions of history. They don't know dick about most of the history, right? Because these people don't tell them what the history is. They talk about like Ukraine making these statements, zero justification, right? The people that are always asking that you should justify objectively everything that you say, right? Never justify anything and blurt out idiotic nonsense such as Ukraine has no right to exist, right? What's going to be the next? What party line are they going to toe next, right? The Baltic states have no right to exist, and then what? Poland has no right to exist. Fucking zombies, man. Get the fuck out of here. Long ass fucking video. I know, but it had to be done. People are fucking sheep, man. Anybody who thinks that like there is this is what we're looking at here is a battle of good and evil is completely and utterly fucking demoralized and has no clue what good and evil is. When it's convenient, right? They know exactly what good and evil is. And it's so obvious and matter of fact to them. And it's so crystal clear and clear cut. They never objectively justify these statements that they make, right? But when you say the exact same thing, you're just repeating their words back to them. Except the agents change, right? And it's no longer America, but now it's Russia. All of a sudden they want some kind of objective moral justification, which they themselves never provided in the first place. You're just putting a fucking mirror up to their face, except shit is, reflected and it's not exactly the same, but more or less. You know what I'm saying? Left is right and right is left all of a sudden. All of a sudden you need some kind of grandiose philosophical explanation when they never in their lives ever provided you with any for the exact same moral claims that they were making when it was fucking convenient. The fuck out of here, man. That's my video. Hope it was loud enough for you.